My name is Leon and this is On Lightness, a monthly podcast consisting of conversations with people from different fields about the meanings of the word lightness. This month it's a conversation with architect and industrial designer Christian Borger about how scarcity shaped his designs, how important it is to create things with your hands, and the lightness of being in the flow state. We had this conversation in late March in front of the Metropolitan Opera House in Manhattan, New York. I hope you enjoy it. We are going to talk about lightness. The idea is that this is separated into the three definitions of lightness. The English word, which is lightness in the sense of weight, so lack of weight. Then lightness in the sense of brightness, luminance. And lightness in the sense of feeling lightness, feeling without burden. We're going to start with the weight aspect, but before we do that, maybe you could introduce yourself a bit, what you do, and how you came to do what you do.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for having me. Glad we got the chance to meet up. I'm Christian Borger. I'm a designer and kind of an artist, somewhere in between. I like to make things with my hands ultimately. My background is in architecture. I studied architecture at Boston Architectural College. I'm currently still based in Boston, where I work a day job in architectural building technology and then sort of run my own studio and independent practice that's ultimately begun to focus very heavily on sort of lightweight structures and lightweight assemblies, and mostly in the form of furniture and smaller handheld objects, and hopefully we'll transition at some point into architecture, but that's where I am for now.
Okay. So for the weight aspect, normally I like to rant a bit about how our built environment is very heavy, and how it could be lighter. I'm gonna keep the rant short, but maybe how did you come into contact with this topic? Because you said you studied architecture. Was it already in the studies? Was it through research? How did you?
Yeah, I think it actually happened sort of unexpectedly, or maybe it came from a place sort of subconsciously that came out just through exploring and doing work. I had gotten into kind of physical making and designing, and then making the things that I design in school. I took a few furniture classes, and some of the projects were, make a stool or make a chair for a project. And I actually really fell in love with the idea of furniture as a way to explore design, because as a student you don't have a ton of money, and also you don't have a ton of space, and you don't have a ton of time. And so even in architecture school, when you want to make architecture, it's really hard because it takes a long time and a lot of money, and often it's never a project that you can actually do individually too. It's always a sort of a team effort. And so I think furniture to me at the time was a really important moment where I realized that I could take ideas that I was interested in and implement them in an object that was built, and then you could use them and test them. And in the case of furniture, they were very kind of common objects that we all know and recognize and are familiar with. And so I got into making furniture in 2016, 2017, and then I graduated and I worked for a design office that also had a fabrication shop in the basement, and I worked in the shop there as a designer and a fabricator, and we made kind of custom millwork and did some fabrication research. And so I was very into like CNC and digital fabrication, and how does that affect the built environment, and how can we explore that. But when my time at that office came to a close, I realized I didn't want to stop making things. I was using their shop space, and so it was kind of the big jump for me to rent my own studio space and get my own tools and then make my own work. And obviously I didn't have a lot of money and it was all new to me. So I ended up renting a pretty small space with no windows in like a warehouse building that a friend of mine actually had a studio in, and kind of bought the bare minimum tools and started to think about how, like, what could I continue to make? And I kind of struggled for a little while because I realized I was trying to force the processes that I was used to with all the tools and fancy equipment and sort of design tools even, and force them onto a space that didn't have that. And I kind of got to a moment of reflection where I realized this was a time to study the result of a different process, or like having a different space, or like what are the constraints and how can those actually influence the work that you produce, rather than try to think of something you want to make and force it onto the tools or space or resources that you have. So that's a long way of segueing into, that's sort of where I stumbled upon the idea of like these lightweight structural studies, because I started to build models again and using these sort of small, intricate assemblies where you're not thinking about, joints or like very intricate details as much as you're thinking about an assembly of parts when you're making a model, because you can't get super detailed. And I started to look at these models and realize that they were almost these like somewhere between architecture and furniture scale, and we're kind of thinking about lightweight and structure and kind of structural principles and how things stand up. And since I was making them out of sticks instead of sheets like you would make things on a CNC, it started to really experiment with like, tension and compression, like the classic sort of structural principles. And I had made a couple tables that were models. They were maybe 6 inches long, and then looked at one of them and said, this could just be, what if you scaled it up, to full scale? And I made one table and I made one chair, very simple sort of truss assemblies, all out of pine sticks. And I think that was the moment where I was like, I really think this idea is interesting. And it felt like it was a very natural thing that came from me and wasn't forced. And since then have just sort of spiraled completely out of control. Like it's just become like an obsession in a lot of ways, and something that I knew was fit for me at the time because I haven't gotten bored of it yet.
So the limitations, or kind of the fact of having some sort of scarcity, that brought you to the principles of lightweightness, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was really informed by a material constraint and a resources constraint, because at the time all I had was a table saw and a chop saw and sort of basic hand tools. And so material wise, I was just going to like the home improvement store. I was just going to Home Depot and buying cheap lumber, nothing fancy.
Yeah.
And also the space that I had was so small that I couldn't bring in a sheet of plywood. It was going to like take up half the room. And my table saw only had so much distance from the back of the saw to the wall too. So like everything was very constrained in a way that initially felt like it was going to be a big hurdle. But then I realized that even the spatial constraints have a really interesting influence on how you make work.
I think this kind of situation also historically often led to innovation, moments where you have scarcity.
Because I think if you have everything, you never know what to do.
Yeah, you're overwhelmed.
You're just overwhelmed, yeah.
Yeah. And we already can have so much without having a lot of space or a lot of money. I recently talked to people who work in the biomimetic field, the bionics, and they often talk about how in nature you kind of have this intricate complex shapes with just like 3 materials that nature has, and our built environment is very much the opposite, that shapes are extremely simple, everything is like boxed or framed, and we have so many materials at the end.
No, absolutely, it's so true.
Yeah, I think that's
nature always finds the most efficient way too, otherwise it the sort of
it's crazy.
It's evolution. What doesn't work doesn't make it.
Yeah. Okay, so do you remember one object that you designed that was especially lightweight compared to the function that it could deliver?
Yeah, I think that's actually sort of ultimately has been a underlying principle that I try to keep in mind for most of the things that I make now as well. I think for me, especially working with furniture, there's a lot of artists out there that will make chairs or pieces of furniture and they're kind of purely experimental, which of course, like this is not a critique on that. It's maybe just a different perspective, because I think that all of that work is valid in that space. But I think to me, furniture has always been a really interesting subject or canvas to work with, because it has always needed to perform a specific function. And sort of this level of performance, I think, has always been a really interesting place for me to test an idea onto. So that way it's not purely experimental or purely theoretical. It needs to serve a purpose. I think, to me, there's two pieces that I can think of. One is sort of the third iteration of sort of the second chair that I had designed. There was the first chair that was really one of the first pieces that I made sort of in the lightweight studies, but it was not quite structurally sound. And sitting on it, you could sit on it very gently, and I'm not a big person, so it didn't feel to me that it was at the point where it felt like it was serving the purpose of a chair. And so I worked through another sort of series of iterations, slightly changing the design a little bit into more of a braced space frame construction, as opposed to thinking about a chair as just four legs and a back. And I think that was kind of a turning point for me, because it makes you think like the chair ultimately is just two surfaces at an angle, and what's underneath just needs to support that. I mean, obviously some people might disagree that you have leg room and things like that, but ultimately it was sort of thinking about the basics of a chair and then thinking about the most efficient and sort of high performance way to create one in the methods that I was kind of exploring. And so sort of creating this three-dimensional grid with diagonal bracing turned out to be sort of a successful route, and then just kind of experimenting with what that top surface would be. But that one ultimately, I think, it was successful in the sense that it not only worked as a chair, but it felt like I had sort of found a system by which could be applied to other things. So tables or, shelving, or sort of like it felt like an interesting way to then kind of make a modular system. And I think partially like weight and performance wise it was successful, but also something that you had alluded to earlier, the weight of the thought was much lighter, because once I had sort of discovered there was a system that I could work within, the designing of other things was so much easier, because you've sort of worked really hard to answer a lot of the questions before you even start designing. So I think that the chair to me is kind of the turning point and an important moment for me.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine that the surfaces were the biggest challenges in the way, because you have the system based on sticks, kind of. And what is your experience with the materials that work in that regard? Because in the lightweight field, you often also have these textile roofs when it comes to minimal material solutions. What was your experience with that?
I think that's a great question, because I think that's ultimately one of the things that I still feel like there's a ton of exploration to be done for me personally. Because I started off, I had found a guy who was making these skin-on-frame canoes, and it felt very aligned to the ethos and the sort of philosophy behind what I was doing. And traditionally, those canoes are wrapped in fiberglass, and they're stretched fiberglass, and then they epoxy over them to give it a hard shell. But this guy, his grandfather, had come up with this idea that you could use ultralight aircraft wing fabric that they use to wrap the skeletal wings of small aircraft. And it's this sort of, it shrinks under heat. So you kind of loosely wrap your object and then heat it up, and it becomes very taut in the center, almost like a drum. And I saw these canoes and I was like, oh my gosh, like this could be an amazing surface, because it seems like it's the bare minimum, you know, like it's imagining a tabletop that's as thin as a piece of cloth, like, was really interesting to me. And so I had made a couple tables using the fabric, the tensioned fabric surface. And, you know, they're very experimental in that sense, where, you know, if you put a glass of water on it, it's going to bounce around a little bit. But ultimately, I thought it was kind of an interesting compromise between what a table needs to do and, like, you know, could you work on a laptop on it? Absolutely. And was obviously taking out any of the weight of what generally is the heaviest part of a table, which is the top. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that I could segue that idea into a chair seat and a chair back. And that's where the first couple studies from that were maybe less successful, as I realized that you don't want to be feeling a frame of sticks under you when you sit down, because the fabric's very forgiving. And so some studies tried to eliminate the sort of space underneath the seat in order to let the fabric flex so you could sit on it and feel more comfortable, but it just wasn't structurally sound. And so I ended up just taking a step back and finding the thinnest hard surface that I could find, which was Baltic birch plywood, 6 millimeter. And it seems to do pretty well. That was sort of like where I've found compromise right now. And it's kind of become a bit of a design standard for me, is either 6 millimeter or 9 millimeter plywood. But I would like to explore, laminated composites a little bit more. Like, I tried some things with like foam core and foam boards, because it's a sandwich composite and you get that thickness, but the structural capacity. Unfortunately, they're quite expensive. So that, again, like the lightness of my wallet plays into the iteration sometimes. So there's a lot of these things that I feel like have a whole tree of iteration, but, you know, we'll need the dedicated time and sort of financial allotment.
Yeah, I think there's also part of the aesthetic that these furnitures have honesty, or you can see how they are constructed in a way. So the more you pick a material that's like highly industrialized, or like I don't know, maybe used in space, the less you feel like it fits this narrative of something you can construct simply.
Yeah, I think the accessibility of material and like exactly what you said, there's sort of an honesty to being able to assemble what appears to be low value products into something that can perform highly. And I had a lot of recommendations from people about like honeycomb core aluminum, and you know, you go and look at the pricing on it and you're like a tabletop would cost $2,000 now, you know. And so it exactly kind of goes against the principles, because there have been plenty of examples of really lightweight furniture, and I think one of the lightest currently is a chair that's made completely of, you know, molded carbon fiber, but it's probably a $5,000 chair, and no one, you know, in their garage could really make that.
I wonder, because you say furniture is both interesting as a way to, because there's one function it has to serve, and it can also be like a testing ground for bigger structures. Do you sometimes dream of scaling these further up as a studied architect? Is this the bigger dream, or do we take away the beauty of lightness by wanting something bigger that has to serve so many functions and it has to be universal in a way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's a good question. Sometimes I go both ways, you know. Yeah, sometimes I want both at different times. I do think it would be interesting to experiment with maybe temporary structures that are inhabitable, or kind of provide a spatial experience rather than an objective experience. And I think there's a lot to look into there, historically too, and precedents like, Frei Otto, and even just kind of like the history of like tents and nomadic structures, and sort of how people use their environment in these very efficient ways to create just kind of shelter. And I feel like I would like to explore that more. And I think it would be an interesting opportunity for me to break out of my comfort zone, because I think ultimately the systems by which I made furniture might change quite a bit once it gets into sort of a spatial architectural scale. And I think that would be really cool to spend time thinking about and exploring.
One engineer that I spoke to talked about how lightweight construction is very improbable to be a solution for housing, because we like to look for this one type of structure that can serve universal solutions, instead of like splitting solutions for each functions that we might have to figure out. But yeah, historically we are already at a point where things are fatter and fatter, and it might be really hard to reduce comfort maybe also.
I think that's, in my day job, I work in sustainable building technology. And so we're developing insulated facade panels for retrofitting existing buildings that don't have insulation. So this idea that you could wrap the building in a system that gives it better energy performance. But that thought of like, I think we're at a point in society where comfort has become at a certain level of the normal has changed, I guess, historically, where in the winter you'd wear a sweatshirt and then in the summer you'd open the windows. But now we kind of make these sealed boxes where in the summer it can be cool and in the winter it can be hot. And so you can wear a t-shirt year round. And I think that it would require a cultural shift back to, experiencing the world or experiencing shelter in a different way that maybe some people would consider more primitive. but I do think the idea of comfort would have to be redefined.
Also, the idea of lightness might nowadays be like the times of Frei Otto and these pioneers that really just wanted to reduce weight of everything. Maybe now turned more into the idea of like using existing buildings more, reusing material, the way of lightness in the sense of CO2 emissions maybe. And so I wonder a lot if there is still space for the idea of reducing material weight in this building transition that we have to do in the coming years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we are kind of have the data showing that the most energy efficient way to build is to not build anything. It's to use what you have. And also something that I talk a lot about with my girlfriend is the idea of like disassembly, and we make things now that are permanent, and when they need to be removed, they have to be destroyed. And I think that that's something kind of that I'm looking to do some explorations into as well, is sort of like disassemblable structures, things that can be reconfigured, is sort of like the next level of what I think a system could be. Because right now, the way that I build is systematic, but it's also permanently configured. And so in some ways, it provides a single function again, even if it's using very little material. And so I'd like to try to explore more about when something is built, can it be disassembled, and can it have that light footprint in the sense of, at a certain point, if it needs to be gone, it can be gone and then reused and reused in different ways ultimately. But next steps on that for sure.
Yeah. When you just said that, I had to think a bit about Glenn Murcutt, because he his houses are built to be disassembled. They're made from materials you can find in Home Depot stores. They are stilted on the ground, so they don't have a big little footprint, and they are kind of the opposite of the sealed box that we talked about, because they work with the weather, right? So this is kind of a very beautiful prototype what lightweight architecture can be, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I try to think about sort of historical structures by region too. You know, how have people lived here in the Northeast in the USA versus how people live in the desert versus how people live in the jungle, and these sort of different environments. And, you know, we do see like a different level of permanence where the environment is harsher and colder, and sort of the need for, you know, thermal mass and being your walls absorbing heat during the day and giving it back to you at night. And so I don't know, it's sort of a complex thought for me, because those people like Glenn Market set a really great precedent, but ultimately, you know, it only works in certain regions. But I do think that sort of ethos and philosophy could be reapplied to the way that we build anywhere, you know.
I agree. Now that you said that your structures so far are not able to be disassembled, what, let's say one of your tables, what are all the materials you use and how much does the table weigh?
Most recent table uses about as much material of about, I think, 1 or 2 2x4x8 standard dimensional lumber, and then either a polycarbonate or thin plywood top, about a little under half a sheet, by 2 feet by 8 feet, and it weighed 7 or 8 pounds, I think.
Pounds means.
Yeah, I know.
4 kilo?
Yeah.
I think it's
about 4. Yeah.
Oh, that's quite low.
Yeah.
And then you also have.
It was about almost 7 foot long table, so seats six people.
Yeah. Then you have tensile elements and glue, probably, are the way you fix it.
Yeah. So the tensile, all the tensile elements are carbon fiber. So that's my one fancy material. But to be fair, I bought a 4 kilo spool of it, and it's just the strand, and it's not wound or woven or braided. It's just the fibers. Yeah. And that will last me probably my entire life. Yeah. I think when I when I did the calculations of how long it was like 3 miles long in the spool. So I think I have a lot of time to work through it.
Yeah. So in the sense of brightness, let's talk about that a bit, because this is, of course, a bigger topic in architecture than furniture, maybe, unless you design lighting. But can you remember a product or a process where the light played a big role?
Yeah, I think it does, even in the furniture pieces that are not traditionally seen as exuding or reacting to light, because I think part of the structural assembly and sort of the airiness of it allows for light to get into parts of the furniture that generally would not be seen. I think the tables, though, have seen the most development in the sense of using translucent or transparent tops. Both the stretched fabric, I think, provides a really interesting surface by which it obscures what's beneath, but it shows kind of a blurry or obscured understanding of there is an assembly below. So it's sort of this like hybrid between an opaque and transparent surface that shows, and depending on how the light hits it in the morning or when it's low and it can kind of graze the surface, you get a different experience than, say, at night when you might have a floor lamp on and it's glowing from underneath and you sort of see a shadow up onto the surface of the table. So I think those are kind of, to me, they've become fun aesthetic things to play with on top of the sort of priority of lightweight. And the corrugated plastic to me has become really interesting because it has this sort of one-directional optical experience where when you see it along its corrugations, it's sort of transparent, or it's showing that direction of object that follows it. Because a lot of my pieces are sort of X, Y, and Z at 90 degrees to each other. And so along one direction, you see kind of one direction of the members, but the opposite direction is obscured. And then as you shift direction, you see sort of another experience of that. And that's been really interesting to me. And I think that it's been one of my favorite sort of combinations of material, with the wood and the carbon underneath and then the corrugation on top. Because it kind of obscures the carbon fiber too, because the carbon fiber very rarely goes in one direction simultaneously. So I think those are sort of maybe unlikely scenarios of light in the furniture that aren't some of my other studies, which are lamps and lighting.
Yeah. Okay. And with the lamps and lighting, you also play a lot with this kind of material, right?
Yeah, it's the same stretched fabric, yeah. But I think ultimately the lamps have been interesting because it's, to me, much more about expressing the skeleton of the piece and how the fabric kind of gets tight or expands or kind of comes close to the skeleton, or you can start to see like creases and ridges as it wraps around, and then as it kind of needs to transition in dimension, it kind of fades away. And so that's been really fun. I really like this kind of very tightly wrapped object, and seeing how it reacts to the carbon fiber strands or the bracing. It almost adds like it's like a very interesting, almost faceted surface where you're starting to understand the geometry of the piece, but through what's touching or not touching the fabric. Yeah. And especially when it's illuminated, you can really see it because all of the structure is just seen as shadow. But parts of the shadow are sort of fuzzy and parts are very hard and crisp. And so those have been a lot of fun to explore.
It's nice. It's almost like a projection in a way, right? Like a three-dimensional projection.
Yeah, it's like you're standing on the other end of the projector screen. Yeah, it's cool.
Okay, let's talk about the feeling of lightness, which can be seen as many things. It can be the physical sensation of feeling light. For example, when you're swimming, it's maybe the closest thing to feeling weightlessness. And then it can, of course, be emotional, mental, after having a giant workload, feeling lightness. So maybe what are moments of lightness for you?
I think I spoke about it a little bit before, and I think it pertains a lot for me to the mental load in making the work and thinking about, it's obviously, when you're designing something, it's a very rigorous process to sort of conceive and work through and iterate and then think about the dimensions and then how those are the materials, and then how those are going to be assembled into an object that's going to get built, and then how to stage the steps of the assembly and the making of that thing. And I think that's something that this process and sort of the lightweight structures and assemblies has really taught me, is to reduce. By spending a lot of time designing a system, you can reduce the amount of time you spend solving the immediate problem. So if you have a system that's adaptable, then solving the problem of a chair, or solving the problem of a table, or solving the problem of a lamp or a shelf, or in this case, it could scale up to a piece of architecture. Once you've sort of understand, if you can constrain yourself to dimensional standards or assembly standards or the amount of materials you're going to use. So having a library of all of those things, every single project gets easier to do. And to me, that's a lot of what the ultralight or lightweight study has taught me, is to be able to think lightly on a project. A lot of the time it's these days, like I used to make 3D models of everything and kind of very high detail, and the dimensions would all be a little different from project to project. But now I think I've become quite rigorous in like staying to a certain module dimension of like member spacing, or the cross-sectional size of each stick is like fully standardized, and sort of the thickness of tops and how different conditions come together. So how do you go from, X to Y or Y to Z, or how do things stack up against that? And having spent a lot of time iterating through them, the library of sort of standards has gotten bigger. And now, like, this idea, if I want to make a table or a coffee table, I can sort of draw it in a sketchbook with sort of just lines, not very detailed, and just kind of count the modules and know, okay, it's, 5 modules, so 41.5 inches overall, 3/8 to start, 3/8 member, 8-inch spacing, 1.1 at the end to receive the other, so all of the kind of measurements have been resolved. And so the process to me feels very much like the most immediate problem can get the most thought. So if it's changing from a table to a chair, then the biggest thing to solve for is those change of surfaces or change of function, and not so much about how am I actually going to design and make the object. And I think that feeling is like almost like what you said when you finish a big project or you are done with something and you feel very relieved. I think that feeling is kind of consistent throughout the process for me, because it's now become almost like this choreography, like a dance. It's like a dance, like so many of the steps already, and so the steps that change you can spend more time thinking about and make sure they're very precise, because everything. You can depend sort of on the other things to work well. And that's my take on it. And I think I have a lot of other thoughts on this and like realms to think about in terms of the lightweight, but I think me personally, that would be the biggest, the feeling of lightness is in the feeling of this like lightweight process.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the process itself is lightweight, or kind of the moment when you defined your restrictions in a way to the point where you really can focus on the things that are important? Is that kind of the state of lightness is reached when you are in that moment, or is the whole process?
To me, the whole process feels very like it has become very. I like to work fast and I like to iterate quickly, and I like to make things in kind of serial or like chronological studies. And so I think there's a lot of rigor in the quantity that's output. But the process of making, to me, has now become very, I don't know, I think a lot of people who make things talk about it like the flow state, where you don't have to think, you just are doing. And I think ultimately that feeling comes in that process of making, like the physical act of cutting the material and measuring it and then recutting it to size and then putting it down and then assembling it into sort of this three-dimensional object. I think to me that's where in some processes and projects I've worked on in the past, you're still solving a lot of problems there in that stage, and you're having to think very carefully and making sure you're not screwing anything up. And that's not to say I don't mess things up. Actually, every project I mess at least one thing up. But I think I really enjoy being able to enjoy making it, And it's very calming to me to have gotten to a point where a lot of the project standards are resolved and let me sort of enjoy the process of making and just kind of get into the state of working with your hands. And to me, that's something that, as someone who's always liked to make things, is I truly think that's why people like to make things, is when you get into this mental or emotional or kind of physical state where you're just doing, and you're thinking about other things sometimes, or you're thinking about what you're doing, but it doesn't feel heavy. It feels very kind of meditative in that way.
Yeah, maybe the heavy part for me, because I can identify with this a lot, and for me it can be really hard to get to this state. So the heavy part for me would be to define the restrictions, or to really make these decisions that lead to less possibilities, but opens this process of now I can do things. So I think this is also generally in life, not only for a certain work process. For me, I know from myself that in my studies, often my way of working has been that I do something that just feels like, oh, I'm fascinated, I do this, and then I document it, and then while looking back at it, I only really realize what I found interesting, or how to move on, or how to restrict myself.
No, I get that though, because I think that's why I find it very important to actually make things. You know, I love to design, but truthfully, I always design with the intent to make the things that, to me, that's the most important part, is the act of taking an idea, and you've sort of held yourself accountable for thinking about this, and then saying, I'm going to bring this into the world and experience it, whether it's horrible or whether it's good or whether it needs improvement. And I think that the process of iterating, to me, is always about having a physical, tangible thing to look at afterwards. Because like you just said, a lot of times I don't learn until I see it and like I'm done with it and can look at it and think about the things that worked, or think about the things that didn't, or even the process, like thinking about what happened during the creation of the thing. And so that's, I could totally rant for hours on the importance of students, especially, or, you know, since we both went to design school, the importance to like make work, whatever medium it's in. But like, it's never going to be perfect, because perfection doesn't exist, you know. But it's so important to put something out there so you can then reflect upon it from a standpoint that isn't in your head, you know.
Yeah, and in a way, you never reach the state where you have a solution to this. In a way, that's why documenting is so important, because you really have this whole process. In the end, you can really see this timeline, and this is, in a way, much more beautiful than, I don't know, the final.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The process is everything. Yeah. And I feel like I used to be a freelance photographer for a while. I was really into photography, and I think that interest and obsession to document finds its way into what I do. And I think it's super important. And, you know, even social media, like on Instagram, being able to share the process, to me, is really important. Because sometimes I won't post finished work often. You know, sometimes it'll be a month or two between projects, but like being able to like have these little vignettes or stories of something, or an idea, or even something that doesn't work out, or something that was didn't work the way I wanted it to, I think is all really important to like document and look back on, because it's so easy to forget, especially when you're spending so much time doing the thing. Like you said, like it's finished and then you're like, I don't remember what I was thinking about, you know. Yeah. To have it in steps of assembly where it's like the partially finished work is always really important. Yeah. I think it's the most interesting part. Yeah. Everything I do is just more, I think even the finished products are still process work, you know, because it's always about learning from it and going on to the next thing, you know, never about a final thing. Yeah. Partially, I just don't like to finish things either. It's like always like 90% done.
Yeah, I'm also not good at that. Okay,
but, yeah. And then something that you said, I think I just wanted to have a comment on, is that the idea that oftentimes you don't continue to find solutions in some ways, or something about the idea of like, I always find that after a project I'll end up with more questions. And I think that's the important thing for me, is like, I know I'm going in the right direction when I'm more curious, or curious about a different thing, or curious to learn more about an idea after I've finished or during the process of a project. It's like, you know, this whole study for me hasn't been about answering a question. It's been about finding the questions I want to continue to ask. And I think it's a very big moment of maturity for me, I think, as a designer and like a creative, to understand that it's not about finding a solution per se, but about kind of pursuing a curiosity that will result in solutions and answers along the way, but ultimately wants to continue to develop as a question and as an idea.
So ideally you would mostly be doing the work you do as a side hustle now. In an ideal world, you would just do
full-time.
Maybe
yeah,
do
hopefully.
this full time.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you'll get there soon.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Though it hasn't been that long, so I'm gonna still be patient.
You're really fast, also.
I work a lot. Yeah.
You work
make a lot of work.
What will it look like when this is your main thing?
It's a great question.
Right now you're working on cutlery. Do you already have a new project in your head, or?
Cutlery, I think, was the first project recently that I've really finished too, which is kind of like I think it was a challenge for me that I wanted to present to myself. Was I always hated the idea of what, you know, my furniture and those studies being, I didn't like the idea of them being products. You know, some people would ask me, oh, would you ever license this to a furniture company, or are you ever going to make these like production runs? And it was never really about that, because it was always just about kind of a genuine curiosity and just making something. But I think that I like the idea of tools, and sort of like along with furniture, I think that like common tools and handheld objects are a very interesting space by which to think about design, and sort of the ideas that I'm thinking about in terms of like processes and how they can be lightweight or efficient, or sort of kind of the classic like designing for manufacture. So the flatware, I think, to me was a good challenge to like make a product and like get it to a point where it's been tested and I feel good that it actually truly performs the function that it should, not experimentally, but like it works. And now kind of getting it to a point where they get sold and it goes into other people's hands and other people use it and they can tell me whether or not it works. And that sort of feedback loop in the public realm is something that I want to explore a little bit more of. And so I think my other thought with my personal work in terms of the furniture and those studies is that I have a hunch, or maybe an intuition, that it will always want to be a personal project for me, and maybe never something that I fully monetize. So I think if I do it full time, I think I want to be very considerate about how I present it as sort of something that makes money. Because at the end of the day, you know, you don't want to ruin it. When you find something good, you don't want to ruin it for yourself. Yeah. And so I think these studies in sort of objects or tools, or there could be versions of the furniture that become more about mass production and product focused and sort of getting things made and out into the world and sold. And I think those are really interesting, because I think that a lot of what we talked about today, this idea of how can we design our world or our environment around us in a way that maybe thinks a bit more about these ideas, is really important. But I think I'm just trying to navigate how that will physically present itself in some of the things I'm working on. Because I think a lot of the experimental furniture stuff is really interesting and kind of raw and very honest in the idea, but it's really not super like practical. But I want to use what I've learned from that to inform other design or making projects, I think.
Yeah, I had many moments where I was thinking about how can I monetize things that I know I want to do. I think maybe that's natural, and it can be quite a hard part, especially when this work is so personal. And what I wonder is, does it change the way you work? That's also part of it. It probably changes the way you work once you try to make something that can be on the market. Another thing that I found interesting is the afterlife, because you talked about the afterlife of a product, and there's really a feeling of fulfillment. I imagine, or I know from experience, that something you make is being used. And this also can be documented, and all these things that make what you make a very personal process.
Yeah. No, I think that I want the things that I make ultimately to be used as such. And, I kind of maybe I feel that I'm pretty good about discerning what is sort of a prototype, like an internal research project, and what is sort of meant to be a product, or kind of something that I think has gotten to a level of quality or performance that it can stand up to the real world. And I think there's value to always doing both, because if you always only think about real world performance and expectations and sort of manufacturing processes and what people expect out of an object, then you'll never maybe progress in some ways. You might do things that have already been done. Not to say that I'm doing anything novel, because I think all I do is actually just think about what other people have done and just have my own take on it. But that being said, sort of caring a little bit less about what people think and doing what you think is interesting, and then finding a compromise between I'm putting this a little bit of myself into this thing that is maybe more understood by as a common thing in the general public sphere. It's a hard thing. I don't know. It's a hard thing to describe, but I think when it comes to monetizing or putting products out there that will have an afterlife outside of my own control, making sure there's a bit of there's myself in it, but that I'm kind of in some ways keeping the things that I feel are like very raw and unrefined in a way that I love to myself, so that I can continue to be happy thinking about things and exploring that work. But I do think that it's helped me be very precise about what I will sell. And I want to really make sure that the things that I make will last and will be used and can be used for a long time, and have a certain level of quality and performance that is maybe better than what's readily available, or kind of what's maybe seen as
sold at
common.
the MoMA.
Yeah, I won't throw big shade on MoMA Design Store, but I think their portable cutlery is not very good. It's not their design, but yeah. And I think it's things like that though that motivate me to like want to. There has been a history of the importance of craft in everyday objects, and I think we're slowly losing that. And I think we could be coming back to it, given that we're going to hit a point of like just saturation of crappy things that are cheap. And I think people eventually will hopefully want to invest in higher quality things. I mean, it'll come along with a lot of cultural changes, like the value of labor and what people think is worth paying for, and how much to pay for that. There's a whole nother conversation there, but I try not to compare myself to mass manufactured products, and I think it's been hard to put monetary value to the things that I make, particularly with flatware, because it's such a common object that people see it as it costs this much to make that thing, But at the end of the day, besides the fact that it's my hands involved in almost every part of the process, and sort of is a handmade object that maybe feels like a manufactured object, feel that it's also a way for me to show that the time that I've put into it is what's giving it value to, because at the end of the day, all we have is time. The money at the end of the day doesn't really matter. I think that's the thing with traditional craft, is that it was the reverence of the amount of time people put into things. And I hope that with the objects or with the furniture or with lighting or with anything that, a lot of my value isn't in the material cost, right? Or it's sometimes not even in the time it made to make the object, because that is often very rapid and fast paced. But overall, kind of putting value into those things by dedicating a lot of my time to it.
It's the process, yeah.
Yeah, and exactly, the time of the process.
Yeah. And your dedication to really deep dive,
Yeah, and I think that's what the kind of what craft has always been, or even art, is it's not about the objective result. It's like we as humans have an appreciation for people that have dedicated time to a very obscure thing, or even dedicated time to a very mundane thing, like both sides. People that have made shoes their whole life, or generations of shoemakers, and have dedicated generations to a single craft that provides sort of a simple, well, arguably not simple, but kind of common thing. And then there's painters that dedicate their whole life to doing something that some people argue is worthless, Yeah. But I think they both have value because of what those people have spent to dedicate their time to it,
In a way, the Japanese are really good at this, no? This is almost the part of the culture, that you find something, some niche, and really do it the best way you can. And I think there's a lot of appreciation for these designs, but at the same time we have this flooding of low value.
I know. Yeah, and
products.
Everyone's talking about how AI is gonna, take everyone's jobs, but I think it goes along with this idea that, I don't know. Our contribution to society is what we dedicate to how we produce and create and contribute things to the world, or even just for ourselves,
All right, maybe this
seems to be a good place
moment
to pause. Yeah,
to pause. Yeah.
It was good. It was a very, very nice conversation, though.
Yeah,
it's good to think about these things.
It's nice. Yeah, I also enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you.